Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So, just want to say a massive thank you to the people who have been watching. As again, please keep watching, subscribe, share this video, share the others, leave a comment, and let's get these algorithms started. So, today's case is one I only recently found out about, probably in the last couple of months or so. But I wanted to do it just to highlight about this case. So the person involved in this, she has been described as the UK's youngest double murderer, female double murderer. So there was a lot of emphasis about her, but not so much her co-defendant. And you'll find out more as I go into the story. So I've tried to find what I can find about these two, but like I said, there's just a lot of focus on her rather than him. So without further ado, let's just get into the story. So this case is about Paul Clarke and Lorraine Thorpe. So Lorraine, she was born in 1994. She was born in Ipswich, and her childhood was described as poverty-stricken. So her and her family moved around quite a lot. At some points, they were living in caravans and homeless shelters, and so obviously it couldn't have been easy. As you guys know, I've been in the same situation, not so much caravans, but having to move around quite a lot. And I think it would have been a lot more difficult for Lorraine because at some point during her childhood, she was diagnosed with ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for those of you who don't know. So her teenage years, she became associated with a group of middle-aged alcoholics who were described as violent thieves. So a lot of the time, especially places like Ipswich, there are what you call street drinkers. So they're the people that you see sort of outside in public high streets, things like that, on benches, in a big group, drinking, whatnot. They're never usually any trouble. It's just that obviously they get a really bad reputation. So Lorraine, she was actually under social services on the at-risk register, and a few times she was taken into care and also placed in specially assigned schools, but she would often run away from this just to go back to the street gang that she was involved in. She would also split this time between the gang and taking care of her father, Desmond. Desmond was a raging alcoholic, like really, really bad, and it got to the point that Lorraine was having to feed, wash, clothe him, which at 15 years old, obviously can't be easy. You still want that protection from your parents, and you don't want at that age to be your parents' carer. So at this point of her life, Lorraine was described as highly manipulative and violent. And in 2019, so 15-year-old Lorraine, she meets 41-year-old Paul Clarke. So just want to point out, Paul and Lorraine both have denied that there was any sort of sexual element to their relationship. They described it as just purely platonic, and Paul was, I believe Lorraine thought that Paul was probably like a father figure to her, and he was the one that would involve her with the street gang. So obviously just hanging around while she was meant to be in school, just hanging around streets or derelict properties, drinking, taking drugs, and so on. So Paul was born in 1968, and he was in the same street drinking crowd as Lorraine's father, and he had previously worked as a serviceman. So he was actually assigned into the armed forces. Um, so Paul was described as really unpleasant, really violent, and he would often brag about his career in the army to anyone who would listen. And Paul quickly became what she described as a role model towards Lorraine. So at this point, she just completely stopped going to school to spend all of her time with Paul. And they would obviously just hang around on the streets doing their thing. She had also at this point stopped taking her ADHD medication, and Lorraine and Paul denied, well, obviously, like I said, they already denied that there was a sort of sexual element to their relationship. The gang would obviously frequent the home of Rosalind Hunt. She was also 41. She was also another part of the street drinking crowd, but the amount of benefits that she was claiming, it allowed her to keep an accommodation above her head, and the gang would often abuse this and use it as another shelter for their drinking and taking drugs. Obviously, if you are in that sort of crowd, from what I see, when you have dependency issues, you often lose any sort of relationships with family, with friends, and I believe this is probably just Rosalind's way of keeping any sort of contact within her life, any sort of social element within her life. She was said to have had a good relationship with her ex-husband, and he was probably the only one that was said to have been really concerned about the gang using Rosalind's flat. So the 1st of August 2009, Rosalind had taken Paul's dog into the town centre, and the dog was said to have either bitten or attempted to bite a child. And Rosalind had obviously reprimanded the dog. It wasn't specified in what way, if she'd hit the dog or yanked it back by its lead. Rosalind had then taken the dog back home, but an unnamed person actually went back to Paul and told him that Rosalind had kicked the dog. So obviously, Paul has then contacted Rosalind, probably with threats of violence. And Rosalind, fearing for her life, she's gone to one of the safe places that she thought that she could go to, and that happened to be Desmond's house, so Lorraine's father. So Lorraine, after being sent by Paul, she arrived at her father's home, and she convinced Rosalind that everything was okay, Rosalind was safe to turn home, the dog was unharmed, and Paul had calmed down by this point. On the 2nd of August, Rosalind, she was actually held hostage in another flat, and she was beaten with a dog chain, and Paul and Lorraine just basically amped this up to the next degree. So one of them had got hold of a cheese grater, and they began using this to harm Rosalind, rubbing it on her skin, I believe on her face, and you can just imagine, like, especially with a lot of force, what damage that could do. At one point, they took a safety guard off an electric fan, and they held this against Rosalind's face. And this attack, they just went on for a number of days at this point. Um, and then they ended up taking Rosalind back to her own home and just basically carried on abusing her, beating her, kicking her, um, continuously whipping her with the dog chain. At Rosalind's home, they again just carried on, and they even at one point had handfuls of salt and were rubbing it into Rosalind's skin. And we all know what that does. I don't have to go into that. We all know how painful salt will be rubbed onto an open wound. So they then left the property, and over the next few days, Paul and Lorraine, they just returned to repeat the attacks. They placed her in a suitcase at one point and even set fire to her hair. And on the 4th of August, the police were actually called to the property. So a neighbour had overheard the commotion, probably overheard Rosalind screaming. They called the police, and the police obviously turned up at the address, and after obviously knocking for a while, they got no response, and they actually left the property, so without doing any sort of proper checks. And obviously we know at this point Rosalind was upstairs, probably just way too injured, way too weak to call out, probably talk, probably walk at this point. So both the officers, they were actually later disciplined for this, for leaving the property without doing any sort of thorough check. Meanwhile, Lorraine was said to have been bragging to her friends about the attacks, so she was ringing them and basically gleefully telling them about how she had stamped on Rosalind's head and obviously other elements of the attack. And later on the 4th of August, Lorraine and Paul actually returned to Rosalind's flat with bowls of sleeping pills, and in their minds they were hoping that they could make Rosalind's death look like a suicide. So they forced Rosalind to take these drugs, and they basically just spent the rest of the day and beat her to death. On the 9th of August, another neighbour contacted the police about their concerns that they hadn't seen Rosalind for a few days at this point, and they noticed in one of Rosalind's windows were broken. They noticed a massive number of flies were around the window, so obviously the police gained entry, found Rosalind's body, and at this point obviously decomposition had already started to set in. So obviously, yeah, they noticed that she had been dead for a couple of days at this point, but Rosalind's death was actually listed under significant lung trauma, which, yeah, if she was being beaten, then yeah, she was going to have some internal injuries, but lung trauma isn't going to show up on the outside. I don't think anyway. I don't think it's going to show up on the outside. And putting an electric fan against someone's faces and using a cheese grater on their skin, it's going to leave some sort of abrasions, some sort of marks. That's not going to contribute to lung trauma, unless obviously they believe that Rosalind was self-harming. So, due to Lorraine's bragging about Rosalind's murder, this actually got back to Desmond, and he made the decision to contact the police. And at this point, Lorraine and Paul decided that Desmond needed to be killed as well. And it was said at this time Lorraine had lost any respect for her father and was said to have resented him for her upbringing. On the 10th of August, Lorraine and Paul took Desmond to his flat on Limerick Close, where over the course of a few hours they beat him senselessly, so the exact same treatment that they subjected Rosalind to. And at the end of this, Lorraine, had taken a pillow and she smothered her father. And Paul ended up taking this pillow outside and chucking it in the bushes. Um, Desmond, was discovered on the 11th of August, and initially they ruled out any sort of foul play. And this was due to the conditions that Desmond had been living in at this point. So you can imagine someone not being taken care of properly, someone like Desmond. The flat probably wasn't in the best conditions, probably very, very dirty, a lot of food and rubbish lying around. So they probably just thought that he died from living in poor conditions. However, they quickly found the pillow and they noticed, obviously, the pillow was covered in blood, and this blood was tested and was a positive match for Desmond. And at this time, Paul was seen skulking around and he was quickly arrested. And another team actually traced Lorraine hiding at her mother's house. And this was when Lorraine was arrested. So during questioning, Lorraine showed absolutely no remorse concerning Rosalind, and both she and Paul denied any sort of involvement in Desmond's death. However, this later changed when Lorraine marked to the police that they would be able to find her footprint on Desmond, and this was referring to a trainer print that was left on Desmond's head. So the trial began in July 2010, and Paul and Lorraine pled not guilty, and it was said that because they were present at the crime scenes, forensic evidence was of little or no use. Something that I really just don't understand. Like, if they were present at the crime scenes, surely their DNA would be present. Like, that really doesn't make any sense to me. But this is just going back over the court judgments, court records, and all that. The reports relied on evidence of the locals, and this proved to be quite difficult, as obviously many of the people that knew Rosalind, who knew Desmond, who knew Paul and Lorraine, were in the same street drinking crowd. And when you are in that sort of environment, it's the old added saying of honour amongst thieves and all that. And I think probably many of them really didn't want to come forward and be seen as a grass. I mean, there was a program about this murder, which is when I first found out about it. It was aired a couple of months ago, sorry. And one of the people interviewed were in the same crowd as Desmond and Lorraine, and even he says that, he struggled with it because he's not a grass, but obviously there's being a grass, and then there's obviously just trying to get justice for someone who's been brutally murdered in this way. So I can imagine, obviously, the courts had a really difficult time trying to piece this evidence together with these people who are seen as untrustworthy. So a lot of these people, obviously, they have a deep distrust for the police, which, again, proved really difficult. Obviously, none of them were willing to help. And obviously Peter Green, so the man I just mentioned, he was one of the ones that came forward to testify, and he managed to obviously get other members of the community to come forward and testify. So the trial lasted for 7 weeks, and Adrian Provence, Rosalind's brother, he said that while he attended, he could see Lorraine regularly laughing and giggling to Paul, and said that no one intervened, no one absolutely stopped this, and speaking out, like the defence was just basically saying that this was down to Lorraine's ADHD at this point. She just didn't really understand the seriousness of what was going on. Because of this as well, because of her ADHD, Lorraine was given regular breaks. I think probably just to process the nature of where she was at this point. So Lorraine and Paul, they completely just stuck to their denial, and even when witnesses discussed hearing them repeatedly say, "We're going to kill you," over and over again. So obviously people probably overheard this. Rosalind's next door neighbour probably overheard this, the one that contacted the police in the first place. They again just completely denied it, and you know, obviously we've all said it in the past. You know, if someone's really annoyed us, we said it, and if that was to get us in trouble, I would probably be serving life sentence 10 times over. But you know, there's saying it and then actually doing it. So speaking on defence, it was given that the only motive was anger. This was aimed probably more at Paul. So they were trying to say that his only motive was anger due to Rosalind kicking his dog. And the prosecution stated that the pair's motive was concerning Rosalind, that they had threatened to report him over concerns of his relationship with Lorraine. In fact, the police, they proved that they had attended Paul's property on the 17th of June 2009 due to these concerns. However, Lorraine, she was found to be living there, and she was taken back into care, and she actually ran away again. And when Desmond's murder had come up, they both said that Desmond had died in his sleep, choking on his vomit, which obviously, going back to obviously Desmond and his problems, it may have stood up in court, but obviously there was no evidence of any vomit in his lungs, still inside his throat, in his mouth. And that wouldn't explain the injuries that he had. And it just speaks out about how stupid these people are. And it's the fact that, you know, Lorraine sat there in her interview and said, "You will find my footprint on my father." That is on tape. That is going to be played to the court. So how she thought this was going to stand up is completely beyond me. So obviously, Desmond's post-mortem, this has shown up bruising inside his bottom lip, and obviously this was attributed to the force of something being pushed into his mouth. So this supported the police's theory of Desmond being smothered. So one witness claimed that Lorraine told him that she killed her father because he was going to grass on her for Rosalind's murder. And at the end of the trial, it was put forward about doubts of Lorraine's age at the time, that she could be held responsible for her actions. They instead wanted to focus on Paul manipulating and coercing Lorraine due to her vulnerability surrounding her past and her ADHD. However, the judge said that Lorraine would still know the difference between right and wrong. And I completely agree with that. I completely understand that, you know. Yes, completely 100% believe that Paul did manipulate and coerce Lorraine. No doubt about it. What other interest is a 41-year-old man going to have in a 15-year-old girl? Other than a sexual one, but obviously a sexual relationship was never proven and it's not really discussed about. And I believe, yeah, like just without Paul's influence, Lorraine definitely knew right from wrong. For example, like my brother, he has ADHD. He has done a lot of silly things in his past. Was put down to his condition. He knew that they were wrong, but it just obviously never to this degree. He knew that things were wrong, what was right, what was wrong, but when you have that sort of condition, I just don't think obviously you act on impulse. It's really really difficult to deal with that kind of condition, especially when you're young. When you're a bit older, you can manage it a lot more easier, I believe, from what I've seen with my brother anyway. I'm not speaking on everyone who has ADHD, but from what I've seen with my brother. So the judge took into account the possibility of Lorraine being groomed by Paul and said that she was also cunning and very manipulative. And Lorraine, at the end of this, was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment. So we're going to get back onto that in a little bit. So summing up, the judge, Justice Sweeney, said that she was responsible for protracted kicking, punching, stamping on Rosalind, who was not in a fit state to defend herself effectively from the outset. By the end of these attacks, she was completely helpless. Far from being sorry, Lorraine appears to have glorified in it, describing to her friends at one stage how she stamped on Rosalind's head. The only possible explanation for Desmond's death can be from the fear that he would go and tell the police what had happened to Rosalind. I don't accept that she was under the control of Mr. Paul Clarke. She is someone who can be quite stubborn and willful and capable of being highly manipulative herself. Her story is an appalling one. So, like I said, obviously Lorraine was sentenced to 14 years and Paul was sentenced to 27 years, I believe it was. So strangely enough, so Paul, at the, I think, 5-year mark of his sentence in 2014, he was actually found unresponsive in his cell. It was believed that his death was put down to a suicide. I believe some reports stated that he had hung himself. Doing my research and looking at other videos, I know you get them a lot, people speaking out saying, oh, they knew this person, they knew that person. One guy stating on a video that he was in the same sort of crowd as Paul, he knew Paul, and they actually ended up in the same prison together. I think obviously Paul maybe came in after this guy, and he basically knew that Paul was apparently like a bit of a Billy bullshitter. He was seen as a bit of a Billy bullshitter, and he asked Paul what he was in for, and Paul openly said murder, and he didn't actually believe him until the point that the case came on TV that year. He also stated that Paul, at some point, because obviously prisoners found out about his co-defendant being 15 and the talks of Paul and Lorraine's relationship, so he was seen as a nonce and was actually put on the VP unit. non-swing, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to stick to the VP unit. I'm just trying to be more professional about this, but I'm going to use the terminology that a prisoner would use against someone like Paul Clarke. So, like I said, obviously, yeah, Paul had by 2014 he had taken his life in his cell, and Lorraine was actually due up for parole this year. So a article was released in March of this year, basically just to highlight about the case, and it spoke about the possibility of her being up for parole by the summer. However, a couple of weeks ago, so I think it was October 17th, so really, really recently, the story was, well, the article, sorry, was released, and it stated that Lorraine had actually had her parole turned down. They believed that she was still a danger, she was still in danger of herself and harming others. So she was denied any sort of parole, she was denied a chance to go to an open prison. And they basically said that they were going to look back into the case and the possibility of another parole within due course. So they haven't put a date on that as of yet. So the Evening Standard, they released an article basically detailing that Lorraine was now in their eyes in the same league as Myra Hindley and Rose West. Basically detailing her as one of Britain's most notorious and violent women. I don't know why they didn't really put Joanna Dennehy in that same list, but you know, they just basically highlighted Myra and Rose. Obviously, two very well-known cases in the UK. So, like I said at the start of the video, so Lorraine's case became officially as the UK's youngest double murderer, and her case was compared to that of Sharon Carr. So Sharon was only 12 years old when she stabbed an 18-year-old girl, Katie Ratcliffe, to death outside a nightclub in 1992. Possibly going to look into that case in the future, but it sounded quite a compelling and interesting case. And also Mary Bell, who strangled 4-year-old Martin Brown and 3-year-old Brian Howe to death in 1968. However, Mary was sentenced to manslaughter and not murder. So again, just going back while doing my research, a lot of videos when it was highlighting about Lorraine being the UK's youngest double murderer, a lot of people will say, well, what about Mary Bell? But obviously, yeah, if you look into the Mary Bell case, you will notice that, yeah, she was done under manslaughter and not murder. Again, I am familiar with the Mary Bell case, but I'm going to probably look into that a little bit further and the reasons as to why Mary was done for manslaughter. So that is the end of this video. Sorry, it's only a short one. I found what I could find about Lorraine and Paul. But as always, I have very limited resources to find this information, and I have to obviously cross-check and double reference myself in regard to this. So I do apologise, it's only probably around the 40-minute mark this video rather than the longer videos I have been doing. But please subscribe, keep subscribing, share and like this video, and I will see you guys next week for another case.